Good morning. We are ready to begin. Please silence your cell phones. Welcome to the 27th Holocaust Conference developed by the Arkansas Holocaust Education Committee. Our sponsors for this event, as well as other events that took place this week, are the Jewish Federation of Arkansas, the Roy and Christine Sturgis Charitable Trust, Bank of America, NA trustee, Temple Shalom of Northwest Arkansas, the Arkansas Holocaust Education Committee, and Congregation at Chaim. Please be aware that each concurrent session has been assigned a specific number of attendees. An ambassador will be responsible for assuring that number will not be exceeded. If you're told that the room is at capacity, please select another session to attend. Each topic is being offered 3 times, so there's ample opportunity for you to attend sessions of interest to you. Cantor Sam Radwine, he is from Congregation at Chaim, will offer a prayer in memory of the Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania shooting at the synagogue that happened just a few weeks ago. Immediately following the prayer, Dr. Kevin Simpson, professor of psychology at John Brown University, will begin his presentation titled The Path to Nazi Genocide.
Please rise. Eloheinu v'Elohei Avotenu, our God and God of our fathers and our mothers, we come together this day to join as one community. This is a holy responsibility. We have come to listen and to bear witness and to try to come to terms with the evil that infects your world, O God. We hear of evil that existed not even 80 years ago, and yet, God, we experienced that evil just this last month. God, we are conscious that yours is yet to be a perfected world. We come together as people of peace. We're blessed to live in a community where brothers and sisters of all traditions reach out to each other in friendship and fellowship to support each other in the face of evil. We thank you, O God, for the presence of Mr. Peter Konstam, who is here to bear witness to the memory of Anne Frank, her family, and all those from the Netherlands who died at the hands of evil. It was Anne Frank whose words taught the world. It's a wonder I haven't abandoned all my ideals. They seem so absurd and impractical. Yet I cling to them because I still believe, in spite of everything, that people are truly good at heart. I share with you the memorial prayer, the El Malei Rachamim, asking God's compassion on all those who have departed, especially those who were murdered in Pittsburgh. El Malei Rachamim, Shochein Bamromim, Hamitzem Nechanechana, Takat Kanfei Hashchina, B'malot Roshim Utwarim, Kezohar Akiyam Azirim, Lizkor Achenu V'Achiotenu, Shenergo Akidosh Hashem, Bol HaRachamim, Yasrehu Kesetek Kenafav Leolamim, Utzro B'tzro HaChayim Et Nishmotam, Adonai Unachalatam, V'yanuchu V'shalom Al Mishkavam, V'nomar Amen. O God, full of compassion, grant perfect rest to the souls of our brothers and our sisters who were murdered in Pittsburgh for the sake of your name. O God, master of life, Find them perfect rest under the shadow of your wing, and may they be bound up in the bonds of life, and let us say, Amen. On this day, O God, we ask, give us all strength to restore the belief that in spite of everything, people are truly good at heart, and let us say together, Amen. You may be seated.
Good morning again, a very poignant start and worth remembering, of course, for the lives which were snuffed out by murderous hate. But we also, again, remember that the study of the Holocaust is the study of humanity's certainly worst moments, but its few bright moments as well. And we'll certainly talk a bit about that this morning's session. So again, on behalf of the Arkansas Holocaust Education Committee, I welcome you. My name is Dr. Kevin Simpson. I teach psychology over at John Brown University, and I'm particularly pleased to be part of this committee. They very graciously welcomed me just a few years ago when we moved to Northwest Arkansas, and so very pleased to be part of this group. So as we get started this morning, our goal for this opening session is somewhat like a Holocaust 101 sort of mindset, meaning that we want to give the broadest sort of understanding of generally what the Holocaust was all about. And so we're going to do that in a number of ways. I also want to make this interactive as well. So there'll be a couple of pause points in the video clip that I'm going to show you here in a few minutes that allow us to, again, interact, maybe ask some questions, respond to some questions that I pose as well. Just to want to push play and let this be kind of just a video session. So I encourage you to ask questions, but also to respond to questions as they're posed here in a bit. So as you, again, break out for the wonderful sessions we have scheduled here in a few minutes, again, be mindful that we're hoping to set the stage here with a foundation, a general overview of what the Holocaust is all about. A natural question might be, how is it that maybe a psychologist like me or someone from this field is interested in this discipline or this area of study? And for me, it's always been about an understanding of how it is that quite often individual people were drawn into this catastrophe. Not only certainly as victims, witnesses, even bystanders, but those, again, who perpetrated the evil. And when you really get down into the deeper aspects of the history, you realize there's a whole lot of psychology there when we look at explanations of the perpetrators. It's all too easy in our modern day, our modern mindset, to think of the Nazis as some exotic evil, but certainly there was a core group of true believers who instigated, organized, planned it, much of it. But the perpetration of it, much of it, was done by ordinary people, both on the soldier side, the collaborator side, and even by the ordinary person who might be staffing a train station or working in an office, a bureaucratic sort of official as well. So for me, it's always been fascinating to look at propaganda, to look at the bystander sort of effect, very, very common sort of concept in the field of psychology. But in our session this morning, we're going to spend some time early on here considering the preconditions. So if you've maybe studied the Holocaust with one of your teachers, you may have a good leg up on this, but we realize not everybody comes to this conference with that same sort of background. So I do welcome you, especially if this is your first conference. We're very pleased to have you here as well. So an initial question I'd pose, and we'll come back to this a little bit later on as well, is why is it that we are better served to consider the Holocaust as something that wasn't inevitable? Maybe if I ask that in a less clunky way, why is it that we ought to look at this history as something that was made up of a bunch of individual choices? So we'll take that rhetorically now, but I want you to think about that for the next few minutes. This is an idea that I begin with in my Holocaust class. In fact, I'm teaching that this fall at JBU. I want my students to realize that this was not an inevitable course of action, that the Holocaust didn't have to happen the way it did, especially as it played out during the war years. I also want you to engage more fully with the film that you'll see here in a minute, because you'll hear certainly witness testimony. You'll see some of the major kind of factual aspects of the Holocaust. But there's real power in the testimony, and you'll certainly learn that later on with our Holocaust survivor after lunch. I also want you to engage with the photographs. And keep in mind, and this is a really key point, that many of the photographs you'll see that are going to be part of this video section were taken by the perpetrators themselves. And I think it's important to realize that they had a particular viewpoint they're trying to convey there. It's not just neutral photography from this era. So in fact, if the perpetrator's involved in it, we want to look at it pretty carefully. We want to look at it with a more critical sort of eye. So as we get started here, in fact, if we advance the slide, I want to begin again with a realization that the preconditions certainly set the stage. The notion maybe that the kindling was set, but there were some crucial events that ignited the flame that eventually became the Holocaust. We begin with, again, the realization that before the war, Germany was in a crisis sort of state, both economically, politically, for sure. There was a nascent or very fledgling sort of democracy in place, trying to get its momentum, but there were forces, again, working against it, both on the left and on the right. The Treaty of Versailles is regularly referred to in Nazi propaganda as an injury to the German state, and so Hitler and his minions regularly referred back to it again as an injustice that needed to be righted. And this was a very appealing idea to Germans coming out of World War I. The notion again that there was a punitive side to this and they wanted to relieve themselves of it as well. The chaos that we talk about was both economic. Maybe you've seen pictures of people from this time having to go to the store with wheelbarrows full of Deutschmarks at the time. Economic depression, of course, was a worldwide phenomenon. Certainly America was caught up in that as well. And massive unemployment, again, made it ripe for fringe ideas to kind of come to the forefront. And Nazism was certainly one of these ideas. The threat of of communism was certainly in the air. Germany's semi-neighbor to the east, Russia, certainly had fallen to communism, and the violence that came with that as well. So certainly if you were maybe a more conservative-minded, maybe more economically entrenched sort of German, you would be wary, especially as a capitalist or maybe a landowner or a factory owner. You would be wary of a communist takeover of Germany as well. So again, these are the economic, political sort of preconditions that are there. We also realize that inasmuch as from the earliest days, the Nazis themselves are promising order, they're promising a restoration of German glory, reclaiming again of German supremacy in Europe, especially Western Europe. This is all part, again, of the messaging that the Nazis are advancing very early on, pretty much from the formation of the party in Munich shortly after World War I. We cannot get past also the realization that Adolf Hitler, as a singular figure, is a very charismatic sort of presenter, and so a number of people are drawn to him. In fact, young people were particularly drawn to Nazism because, again, of its promise of a new order, a new way, a departure from the ways of the past. Another aspect I would add here, especially if you've studied the history of World War I, is the realization that, quite simply, life was cheap. This was a war that, again, was catastrophic for an entire generation. Many young men and some women, of course, did not come home to their countries of origin. And so with this context, it made it a lot easier for the Nazis later on to, in fact, inflict their genocidal policies, starting with their own countrymen and women through so-called euthanasia programs, sterilization, and so on. So we'll hear a bit about that in the clip. But as we see in our own day and age, anti-Semitism kills. There's just no other way to put it, right? The murderous hate that we saw in Pittsburgh just a few weeks ago, it is driven by anti-Semitism that is all too easily spread through the internet nowadays. In this era, anti-Semitism, again, was prevalent in many, many countries throughout Europe. In fact, if you had asked historians of the age if there was going to be a maelstrom, a catastrophe such as the Holocaust, where would it likely to have happened? They would have probably said France, maybe Russia. They likely would have avoided Germany. It was seen as a beacon of intellectual light, scientific progress, a high point of culture in the European sort of continent. And so Germany certainly wouldn't have been seen as vulnerable in that particular way. So as 1933 turns, January, Hitler, of course, is appointed chancellor. You might remember, again, if you've studied this before, the Nazis never had a full majority. In fact, what they did early on, once they gained electoral power in 1932, was to cobble together a coalition. Again, that's notable because that coalition will be wiped out very quickly after 1933 when Hitler, again, and his cohort or consolidating power. So you'll see, again, some of those details here. But we realize, again, that the Nazi menace begins, of course, within the borders of Germany, but it doesn't take long for that threat to broaden out pretty broadly. So this will be a natural place for us to begin our video clip. It'll play about 10 minutes, and then, like I said, we'll have a pause point or two for some questions. So if we go ahead and play that.
But to Hitler as Führer of the German nation.
Adolf Hitler!
The economy had reached rock bottom when the Nazis came to power. They boosted its recovery with huge public works projects for the unemployed.
Eine halbe Million erwerbsloser Volksgenossen wurden in diesem Jahr an den Arbeitsplatz zurückgeführt. Seit der Machtübernahme ist die Arbeitslosigkeit um 61 von 100, also um weit über die Hälfte zurückgegangen.
Hitler christened new Autobahns triumphantly in a display of national will that would unite the country and facilitate the secret expansion of Germany's armed forces. In 1935, Germany openly defied the 1919 Treaty of Versailles by reinstituting the draft and increasing its military strength. The Nazis were delivering on their promises to restore and strengthen the nation. Their achievements encouraged many people to overlook radical Nazi policies, or even to support them. In September 1935, the Nazi Party gathered in Nuremberg for its annual rally. It opened with a traditional hymn that added solemnity and a sense of continuity with the past. It ended with a special session of parliament far from Berlin. New race laws were introduced by Hitler and read by Parliament President Hermann Göring.
Reichsbürger ist nur der Staatsangehörige deutschen oder artverwandten Blutes. Eheschließungen zwischen Juden und Staatsangehörigen deutschen oder artverwandten Blutes sind verboten.
The Nazi regime aimed to create a racially pure Germany, whose so-called superior traits would make it ideally suited to rule the entire European continent. Nazism taught that racial struggle was the driving force in history. Superior races must battle inferior races or be corrupted by them. The Nazi concept of a national community was exclusive and based on race, as defined in the new laws and decrees. Heinrich Himmler and the SS led the ideological battle. Racist ideas were taught in schools. Some groups, such as Jews, Slavs, Blacks, and Roma, also called Gypsies, were labeled racially inferior. People with mental or physical disabilities were designated unworthy of life. Scientists and medical professionals applied pseudo-scientific theories for measuring and valuing racial characteristics. Before the Nazis assumed power, Jews enjoyed all rights of citizenship in Germany. After 1933, the German government gradually excluded Jews from public life and public education. Newly established Jewish private schools provided a safe learning environment for some. By 1938, German authorities had isolated and segregated Germany's Jews, expelling them from the professions and eliminating most opportunities to earn a living.
We felt so, why can't we be part of it? Why can't we? Everybody said Heil Hitler like this. I did too. What did I know? I was 8 years old. So my mother said to me, you're not supposed to do that. I said, why not? She said, haven't you been told that you were Jewish? I said, oh, I forgot.
Germany's Jews would get plenty of reminders.
Meine Herrschaften, hier ist Boykott in jüdischen Warenhäusern. Gehen Sie doch bitte weiter.
This sense of isolation that came upon us after 1933, gradual and increasing, it also affected us psychologically. We knew we were in a hostile world.
Between 1933 and 1939, the German government enacted hundreds of laws to define, segregate, and impoverish German Jews.
My sister and I used to slink by those huge banners that were all over the city, and we used to just try not to see them, thinking if we didn't see them, they weren't there. But they were there. That's just little by little that really took over.
Wer selig geworden ist, der weiß, ohne Lösung der Judenfrage keine Erlösung der Menschheit.
The goal of Nazi propaganda was to demonize Jews and encourage Germans to see Jews as dangerous outsiders in their midst. After 1935, everyday anti-Semitism was a regular part of carnival parades and floats. Public displays of anti-Semitism reinforced a climate of hostility toward Jews in Germany, or at the least, indifference to their treatment. In March 1938, German troops moved into neighboring Austria. Germany shredded another provision of the Versailles Treaty as Hitler's homeland was incorporated into Germany. It was a disaster for Austrian Jews. Within a year, the Nazis achieved in Austria what had taken 5 years to carry out in Germany. On November 9th, the Nazi Party orchestrated an outbreak of anti-Jewish violence throughout Greater Germany. It was a lawless onslaught that outraged the world and provoked criticism of the regime by many Germans. Jewish businesses that had already suffered anti-Semitic attacks were targeted for deliberate vandalism disguised as spontaneous public action. Party officials directed the SA, SS, and Hitler Youth to destroy Jewish shops and torch synagogues. Over 7,000 Jewish-owned businesses were vandalized. Germans named the violent attacks Kristallnacht, Night of Broken Glass, for the shattered windows of Jewish-owned stores that littered the streets. The nationwide violence damaged or destroyed more than 250 synagogues.
After Kristallnacht, I remember driving through Berlin and seeing the synagogues in flames and all the glass on the streets and the people huddled and depressed. They walked around like the victims, like the hunted.
German police filled the concentration camps with thousands of Jewish inmates. The SS released them only if they agreed to emigrate. But Jews faced increasingly restrictive immigration quotas in most countries and bureaucratic hurdles in Germany. A new law issued in October 1938 required Jews to surrender their old passports, which would be valid only after the letter J was stamped on them. 2 months later, another law prevented the flight of capital owned by Jews when the economics ministry froze all Jewish property and assets. Many, who had the means and somewhere to go, tried to leave Germany. Some families sent their children alone to other, safer countries. They could not know how soon the world would be at war.
All right, as we transition here, we'll have a microphone available as well. So if you give us a second to come to you as the questions flow, I'll be glad to hear from you here. Two things that I would say, certainly there's a lot of good factual information there. What I wanted to say earlier is that within 3 months of the Nazis taking power and consolidating it and eliminating enemies, essentially, they're going to use their concentration camp system to do this. So communists, social democrats, others again seen as a threat to the Nazi state, to the burgeoning, growing Nazi state, they're going to be locked up in concentration camps. That's a key event that happens very early on in 1933, within just 3 months of the Nazis taking power. Of course, you see there Kristallnacht, right, which we just recently celebrated the 80th anniversary of. In fact, I was so proud of my students at JBU. They put together a remembrance event just last week. What a lot of people don't know is that November 9th and 10th are the dates of remembrance, but Kristallnacht actually started a couple of days earlier with, in fact, more spontaneous outbursts of violence. But to be clear, Kristallnacht was orchestrated. It was very carefully planned by the Nazis themselves. They were waiting for the opportunity, and when the assassination occurs in Paris, they jump on it. So that's, again, a key distinction here. So a longer question here, but again, I want to give you a chance to interact, maybe ask a question, a follow-up as well here. So as we consider Nazi Germany's actions here, consider this how sort of question. How, in fact, did Nazi Germany gradually isolate, segregate, impoverish, and incarcerate Jews and persecute other perceived enemies of the state between 1933 and 1939? Again, that's a key 5-6 year period. So how did this happen? What did you see there from your reading, your studies, and other places? What have you seen there? Thank you, Madison.
They tried to demonize Jews and other perceived enemies of the state.
Very good. How did they do that, by the way? Hang on to that mic. We'll pretend we're in class. Sorry, he thought you were getting out of class today, but how did they do that? You're exactly right.
Well, they made it seem like they were aliens, and so they were not pure to the state, so they were not pure, so
exactly.
It would ruin the population.
Very good, yeah. Again, we see this even before the Nazis take power. Their propaganda speaks to this, but it gets ramped up, especially in this 5-year window. Consider this as well, and I often do this in my teaching. Consider how we see other groups demonized, maybe even dehumanized. Sometimes the labels, the words, the language we use for groups reveals a lot about our attitudes about them, right? Sometimes I think immigrant groups are certainly captured in this particular way, right? So demonized, dehumanized, excellent start. What else? How else did we see the Nazis moving against? Yes?
They took away their schooling for the children, and they put up lots of signs and separated them. Like on benches, there would be signs, Jews only or not Jews.
Very good. It's the day-to-day life that becomes interrupted, to say the least. It's also, again, a segregation, right? Very clearly, we have this us-them sort of mentality at work, and it's formalized through, again, the educational system. Throughout Nazi Germany, we see the corruption of medicine, law, and the schooling system. Prime example. Very good. Others? How else do you see the Nazis moving against their enemies, so-called enemies? Key event in 1935, by the way.
There was also the development of the Aryan race and how they would say you had to have certain skin colors and eye colors in order to be part of a German citizen. Good. And obviously Jewish people didn't have these characteristics.
Well, sometimes they did. That's
yes.
the strangeness of it. Again, they try to take an ethnic and religious category and turn it into a racial one. But your main point is right. The notion, again, that there was going to be some sort of scientific basis for this, when in fact it's the pseudoscience of eugenics. Yeah, very good. What, in fact, is happening in 1935 that's especially crucial? You saw that there in the clip. Madison, giving you a workout here toward the front. One of my great JBU students.
German citizenship was restricted, and marriage between Jews and Germans was forbidden.
Hang on to that mic. Why is this so important to recognize? Just 2 years into the Nazi reign, why is this important to recognize, the Nuremberg laws?
It's important to recognize because you can see them start to segregate communities and dehumanize Jews and restricting their rights. So,
in fact, if it's codified into law, someone who might be neutral toward the Nazi movement now sees it as part of the German legal code, and they're more apt to obey it. So this is where you bring in people who are maybe neutral, bringing it into the Nazi cause in a way, a more indirect way. Excellent. Other aspects, again, that were crucial here. The development of the terror state as well is something that wasn't referred to. We'll get to that here in a minute. But in addition to imposing themselves on German society, we see a security state that becomes more emboldened, stronger, more menacing. Denouncement by neighbors is often a way, again, Jews are revealed, especially, in fact, if they did look Aryan, which many of them did. Yeah. Other aspects. Good.
You said that there was, it was at the time when financially depressed state?
Early on, right. Oh, right, that was your point. Sorry, I'm a little slow, apparently. Yeah, let me follow up, and anybody can chime in on this. Why would such a strong economic downturn play into the Nazis' hands? This kind of goes a little bit deeper. Why would that be?
I'm going backwards for a moment, but I think your point in 1935 was the Treaty of Versailles. Am I correct?
It was the Nuremberg laws, but Versailles is something, again, that's going to be continually challenged through the militarization of the Nazi state.
But back to the boycotting.
Yes.
Which sadly is happening again today. If you're boycotting the Jews and their merchandise, then they are not able to earn the income that they need to provide for their families.
Yeah, the process we call Aryanization. We see this particularly in Germany. We'll see this in Austria after the Anschluss of the Nazi takeover there as well. Again, it's marginalization of Jewish business owners, apartment owners. And in a lot of ways, this is where we don't always account for the ordinary people coming in and actually benefiting from this. It's a type of plunder that sometimes the common person could take advantage of. The neighbor might have an apartment they covet. They can simply come in once that neighbor is removed economically or physically. Yeah, excellent. All right, I think we'll transition to the next clip, and I'll have another couple questions for you. We're going to now move into the war years. Again, these are very crucial for what, in fact, is coming in terms of the creation of the Holocaust by bullets and also the Holocaust by industrial killing.
As the Nazi regime implemented its long-standing goal of territorial expansion, aggression against Germany's neighbors initially succeeded without encountering armed resistance. Hitler counted on the reluctance of Britain and Europe to intervene for fear of another war. The German occupation of Prague, capital of Czechoslovakia, left no doubt as to Germany's intent on military conquest in Eastern Europe. On September 1st, 1939, a massive German force invaded and conquered Poland within a month. It was the start of the Second World War. In April 1940, Germany occupied Denmark and Norway. In May, the German armed forces attacked France, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and Belgium. In June, Paris fell, and France surrendered. The swift and unexpected victory over France avenged Germany's defeat and humiliation in the First World War. It propelled Hitler to a new level of popularity and trust among the German people. In June 1941, the German army, with more than 3 million soldiers, invaded the Soviet Union to wage a war of annihilation that targeted tens of millions of civilians. Under conditions of war and military occupation, the Nazi regime could pursue its political and racial goals with more radical measures. As German troops advanced into Eastern Europe, Germany's power extended over millions more Jewish inhabitants in the occupied lands, where German authorities could exploit existing anti-Jewish attitudes among local populations. Across Eastern Europe, German authorities forced those identified as Jews into tightly packed areas called ghettos. Separated from the non-Jewish population, Jews in the larger ghettos were imprisoned behind brick walls and barbed wire. The German drive eastward was cast as a crusade against Judaism and communism, in the Nazi view, two aspects of the same evil. German soldiers and police officials treated Soviet prisoners of war as subhumans, either shooting them or deliberately causing their deaths by exposure to the elements and by starvation. Millions died in German captivity. On the Eastern Front, racial political instruction was part of regular training for all types of German occupation forces. SS Chief Heinrich Himmler referred to the war against the Soviet Union in an address to his men. This invasion is an ideological battle and a struggle of races. Here in this struggle stands National Socialism, an ideology based on the value of our Germanic Nordic blood. On the other side stands a population of 180 million, a mixture of races whose very names are unpronounceable and whose physique is such that one can shoot them down without pity and compassion. In July 1941, Hermann Göring, Hitler's second in command, authorized all necessary preparations for the final solution of the Jewish question in the European territory under German control. As German military forces advanced, mobile killing squads advanced with them. The German army, military SS, and German police units took an active part in authorized mass murders. The Germans and their accomplices rounded up the victims, drove them on foot or in trucks to a killing site, often made them remove their clothes, and shot them. Participants in the murders included local collaborators, especially police, in Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Ukraine, and Belarus. The German killing squads and their auxiliaries murdered at least 2 million Jewish men, women, and children in mass shooting operations.
Again, I've been teaching the subject for a number of years, and it doesn't get any easier to watch that particular scene that was filmed in Latvia, and I actually use it. I show it a couple times when I do screen it, because it certainly conveys a horrific truth that, in fact, the Holocaust primarily starts with this one-to-one sort of killing, where there's a bullet and there's one victim. And then you heard there, 2 million lost their lives this way. But I also use that clip to help my students understand that there were a whole lot of bystanders there, of all different sorts of backgrounds, though primarily military or Navy-based. But it's remarkable, again, that an event like this would actually draw spectators. My students also read a bit of testimony accounts from witnesses who were shooters or bystanders. It's remarkably powerful to encounter that. So I want to pause here just for a moment to ask this very simple question, which of course has some complexity to it. Why, in fact, was the war necessary for the Holocaust to occur? There are a number of ways we can interpret this. Why is the war necessary? Down in front here. Unless you can project your voice loudly. Very good. Very good. You said a lot there, and you said it well. If you didn't quite hear it, it's the realization that the Nazis didn't have full control. They didn't have full radicalization, if you want to put it that way. It's the realization that the Nazis are also improvising over time. Initially, it was about immigration. Let's get the Jews out by force their removal, both economic and forcibly. But there's an escalation there, right? That's a key distinction. In fact, as the Nazis conquer East, they are actually acquiring more Jews than they know what to do with. And I know that sounds maybe a little insensitive. I certainly don't mean it that way, but it's the realization they have, from their viewpoint, problems to solve. And that's where, again, they move towards the improvisation of the camps and everything that follows from that. So excellent, excellent point there. One way to remember this, especially if you haven't studied this before, is the realization, it's a phrase that's used very commonly in Holocaust studies, that this movement, the Nazi movement, is about race and space. It's colonialism. It's also, again, a racial purity sort of movement. So race and space is a way to think about it. Now, here's a strange and rather chilling twist on this. If you saw much of the video footage out of Charlottesville a couple of summers ago, you might remember that some of the neo-Nazis there, the white supremacists, were chanting blood and soil, right? This is taken straight from the Nazi playbook. So again, these are primarily young men who've been looking at this history, trying to reignite it in a way, but they're capturing the same sort of sentiments here regarding race and space, okay? Why else is the war necessary? Yeah, down in the middle here.
I'm sorry, I have a question, but who funded Hitler?
Oh, golly.
And if you want to, I don't know if you wanted to get into that, because I know the answer to that question, but I'm just posing the question.
The war effort essentially funds Hitler, if that's what you're referring to, once he's in power, once the Nazis are in power. Also plunder. It's plunder that funds the Nazis. Every country they conquer, one of the first things they do is to go into the central bank and take the gold reserves and take the cash reserves. So it's conquering. It's also the buildup of the German military machine. Would you add something to that? Have I missed it? Have I gotten the question wrong? Seriously, would you add? Did you want to? No? Okay, okay. I thought maybe you had something else there. Why else is the war necessary here? Think about some of the other things we talked about. Yes? Very good. Yeah. The war does provide cover. It also, again, provides the logistical support, if you want to think of it that way. In fact, the killing squads that you saw there, they're following very closely behind the German army. One thing that was rather remarkable in the last about 20-year window is the realization that, in fact, the regular German army, the Wehrmacht, was implicated in a lot of the murders that happened. There was initially a myth that the average German soldier did not have blood on his hands, but in fact was rather implicated in a number of instances. We talk about this as well regarding the euthanasia program. It's called the T4 program. There's actually an order, one of the few orders ever signed by Hitler, that essentially backdates the initiation of this program to coincide with the invasion of Poland on September 1st, 1939. This, again, is a clear message that there's going to be linkage between, again, this effort to purge Germany of its racially and physically, so-called physically impure people, with what's going to happen in the war. And there's some evidence to suggest, fairly recent evidence to suggest that German soldiers themselves were murdered in this way, along with psychiatric patients and the developmentally disabled. All right, why don't we move on here so we have time for our last question, and we'll catch the last clips.
In Germany, SS and police deported the remaining Jews to the occupied Eastern territories. In German-occupied Warsaw, the walled ghetto that German Jews entered as newcomers in 1942 was already a place of mass suffering due to terrible overcrowding, lack of sanitation, disease, and starvation imposed by the Germans. Despite all efforts of the imprisoned Jews to find ways of surviving and sustaining their communities, those conditions increasingly led to death for scores of thousands. Most vulnerable were the orphaned children. Originally, German occupation authorities established ghettos to concentrate Jews and separate them from the non-Jewish population. Later in the war, many ghettos served as staging grounds for the transportation of Jews to the east, euphemistically called resettlement by the Germans, who promised their captives better conditions and opportunities to work. People endured unimaginable suffering on journeys that lasted days without food, water, or toilet facilities. Many of the weak, the young, and the elderly died before reaching the destination. The Germans and their collaborators deported roughly 2.7 million Jews and others to killing centers in German-occupied Poland. At the largest of the camps, Auschwitz-Birkenau, transports arrived from all across Europe.
Transports were coming in every day. People with all kinds of different languages. Hungarian, Poles, Czechoslovakian, from Holland, from France, from Belgium, from Germany, from Italy, Russians. They were from everywhere.
My wife was somehow waving to me, and that's the last I've seen of her.
The smell, gas chambers. When I asked, when will I see my mother, I was shown the smoke. This is how I found out where she went.
It took a long time until I started to realize that we are condemned to die. All Jews are condemned to die.
Those whom the SS judged unable to work were killed, often within 2 or 3 hours of arrival. Those who could work would be used for forced labor under punishing conditions. When they could no longer work, they too would be put to death. In several killing facilities, exclusively designed to kill human beings on an industrial scale, camp authorities used poison gas to murder children, women, and men. At these killing centers, nearly half of all Holocaust victims died. The camps of Majdanek and Auschwitz were the first liberated as Soviet troops reached Poland. News of Majdanek's liberation in summer 1944 was met with disbelief. The New York Herald Tribune said, "Maybe we should wait for further corroboration. This sounds inconceivable." In April 1945, U.S. troops in Germany and Austria came upon concentration camps at Buchenwald, Dachau, Nordhausen, Mauthausen, and Ohrdruf. The soldiers saw the camps with their own eyes, and the truth was undeniable. General Dwight Eisenhower, commander of the Allied Liberating Forces, wrote, "The things I saw beggar description. The visual evidence and the verbal testimony of starvation, cruelty, and bestiality were overpowering." In American movie theaters, newsreels made witnesses of thousands more. One commentator said, "To future generations, it must be told. Once man did this to his brothers. In the 20th century, there existed a civilization which for 12 years returned to barbarism." Shock permeated the camps as liberating troops tried to grasp what they had found. Soldiers did all they could to attend to the dead and to support the living. Those who survived faced the slow task of reclaiming their dignity and returning somehow to life.
All right, as brief as that is, that certainly still touches the heart, touches the soul, even if maybe you've seen those images before. So as we close out, we realize we're getting close to the end of time here. We need to send you on your way. Previously, we had some time to maybe look at another clip regarding why we remember. But for a question, and I'm directing this very much to you students here in the room, why is it in fact important to study the Holocaust? You're here. You're committed to it. Maybe you've read some memoirs. Maybe you've read Anne Frank, maybe Primo Levi, maybe Elie Wiesel. Why is it important to study the Holocaust? Think about the context we're in this historical moment as well. Why is it important to study? Just a couple minutes here. Yeah, in the middle.
I think it's more important now than ever before, especially in light of all these recent hate crimes that have been happening all around the world, especially in our own country, to know like what happened in the past and know that the only thing we can do is educate ourselves and others to make sure that that doesn't happen again.
Very good. You may have heard recently that anti-Semitic acts, both in high school, college, and in Jewish community centers, for instance, are up 57% since 2016. It does speak to the tumultuous time we're in. I think some of it has to do with the incendiary political rhetoric that we hear as well, but you're exactly right. We're in a moment. We are certainly in a moment. Yeah, very good. Why else might it be important? What else do you see there?
Another thing is the events of the Holocaust aren't quite repeating themselves exactly, but there are so many refugees from all around the world that are seeking refuge, and our country and other countries are turning their backs on them and not letting them in, and repeating events of hate and rejection for people who need help.
You're very right. Yeah, you said that well. We realized that what could have happened in terms of rescuing many thousands, if not millions, before the war didn't happen. And we see some of those themes repeating here now. We do. Yeah, excellent point. All right, we certainly could say more about that, but you'll get some chances to think more deeply about this later on. And we have a roster of wonderful selections, presentations. I hope you get a chance to visit the ones that are scheduled there, that you've caught your eye. Again, I welcome you. Enjoy the day, and we'll close on that note.